Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's Law Awareness webinar, jointly organized by Law Society Pro Bono Services and PAVE. I am Christine, your host this evening. Today, we have the privilege of Dr. Sudha Nair and Ms. Dharma Jayaram on our panel, where we will be talking about family violence and its social and legal aspects. If you have ever wondered if you or your loved ones have been subject to family violence and are unsure what to do about it, this webinar is for you. If, on the other hand, you have concerns about whether your behavior towards family members crosses the line into family violence, these concerns will be addressed during today's discussions. Dr. Sudha Nair has a PhD in social work. She is Executive Director of PAVE Integrated Services for Individual and Family Protection Specialist Service Center. A practicing social worker with over 30 years of experience, she also spent a decade in academia, teaching social work at the National University of Singapore. Thank you, Dr. Nair, for coming to join us today.
Good evening, Christine.
Ms. Dharma Jayaram is the Managing Director of Dharma Law LLC. Over the last 2 decades, she has gained legal experience in both the private and public sectors. Dharma's family law practice extends beyond litigation and mediation. She is a court-appointed parenting coordinator, family mediator, and also sits on the Family Law Practicing Committee of the Singapore Law Society. Thank you, Dharma, for joining us today. Just some housekeeping matters before we get started. Materials in this webinar do not substitute any form of professional legal advice. If you do require legal advice, please consult a lawyer. Our goal today is that you will come away with a clearer understanding of family violence, as well as the help that is available for families struggling with violence at home. Let's begin with the basic question. What is family violence? Most people understand family violence to mean physical and verbal abuse, but the legal definition is in fact broader than these obvious forms of family violence. Dharma, could you shed some light on what constitute family violence, please?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Christine, for the question. It's important to see family violence. I mean, it's a construct. It's important to know that family violence is talking about the family structure. It's about the people in the family. So the law that talks about family violence is actually the Women's Charter, and the Women's Charter also protects the men and the children in a family. So don't go away thinking that the Women's Charter is only for women. A family member is defined in our laws as a spouse or a former spouse of the person, a child of the person, including an adopted or stepchild, a father or mother of the person, a father-in-law or mother-in-law of that person who's the victim, a brother or sister of the person, and any other relative or person who, in the opinion of the court, should be, in the circumstances, regarded as the member of the family. And in that sense, it could mean cousins, nephews, or stepbrothers, So if they are living together in a family structure, the court is willing to look at that as a family person, So there is a catch-all. Unfortunately, girlfriends, boyfriends, maybe ex-in-laws may not be directly defined. I mean, they're not directly family members as far as the definition is concerned. Yep, unless maybe they stay in the same house. Violence, family violence is committed in the following circumstances as far as the law is concerned: willfully or knowingly placing or attempting to place a family member in fear of hurt, like threatening them, threatening or verbal abuse, causing hurt to a family member by such act which is known or ought to have been known would result in hurt, wrongfully confining or restraining a family member against his will, or causing continual harassment with intent to cause or knowing that it is likely to cause anguish to a family member. So this would be the definition. If you use force to defend yourself, that's outside this definition for family violence. And corrections towards children, like a simple corporal punishment, not abusive behavior, is also outside this definition. Yeah.
Yes. And in all of these, Dharma, is intent important?
Yes. It's the conduct of the party that is trying to commission this family violence, and there must be more than one episode. So you can actually see that there must be some intention for that, the person committing the family violence to want to create that kind of fear or apprehension of fear or hurt on the family member. And it's broadly like even stalking or calling them at their office incessantly, with a view, I mean, knowing that they might, be fearful of losing their job and things like that, you see. So it's not necessarily just a physical act. It could be just a continuous series of violent activity. When I say violence, I mean, violence could be abusive behavior, also emotional threat, psychological threat, and all that.
And Dr. Sudhir, can you share with us, please, from a sociological perspective, what is family violence? What does it look like?
Okay. Before I go into that, I'd like to add that, this whole concept of intimate partner violence, dating violence, girlfriend and boyfriend, although it's not covered in the Women's Charter, the Protection for Harassment Act actually covers that. And I think we may be talking about that a little later. So it's true that a lot of people think of violence as physical, if you're physically abused, so you often hear questions like, were there any bruises, were you punched or were you hit? But there's a whole continuum of things that happen in violence, so the definition of family violence is not just a one-time, one-off episode. Basically, it's a systematic pattern of behaviors that are used to gain power and control over a person. So if you think about a relationship, or let's look at the issue of spousal violence, for example. In spousal violence, in a marital relationship, it's about partnership. It's an equal partnership, and even if you quarrel with someone or you're angry with your spouse, fear is not an element there. You can argue back and and have an argument without fear of being hurt. But in a family violence relationship, the intent to cause hurt and the fear is actually very strong, right? So it's an imbalance of power, and it strikes anyone. And there are different forms of family violence. So often people think of physical abuse as the main issue, but there's a whole range of other kinds of abuse which we sometimes call coercive control. So for example, intimidation, right? Sometimes we will find people who use abuse. They don't physically hurt, but they will throw things at the side of the survivor, okay, or they destroy the property of the survivor with an intent, with that intention to cause fear. Okay, sometimes we have cases where the person who uses abuse actually takes out all the knives from the kitchen and places it on the table. Okay, so that's also another form of intimidation and emotional abuse, because people get really, really scared. Then you have things like, frequent put downs. You're a bad husband or a wife, you're a bad mother or a father, you're good for nothing. So much so that the person loses their sense of self-esteem and confidence. Then there's also the minimizing and denying that it ever happened. So sometimes you get situations where the survivor was badly hurt, but then they tell the survivor, but it was just a tap. Why are you making a big deal of it? Anyway, you were the one who provoked it. I didn't mean to do it, but it was you who did it. So much so that after a while, the person starts second guessing themselves. Then of course this whole idea of silent treatment, which I think is very common in a lot of relationships, but silent treatment can also become a form of abuse, because the perpetrator uses that as a means to get the survivor to do what they want, right? And so they give in, right? We have seen a lot of cases, and this is one of the key characteristics of a person in a violent relationship, and that is the gradual isolation of the person from their support network. So it starts off very in a very nondescript way, like for example, in the beginning of the relationship, it is, why do you want to spend time with your family when you have me? Why do you want to spend time with your friends when you have me? And gradually, the entire support network is cut off. And another very common one, in which I think Dharma also mentioned just now, was stalking. Standing outside the office, following them all over the place, putting location devices into their phone so that they can track where they are going, and then appearing there. Sometimes even calling them up like 10 times or 20 times or 30 times within an hour. All this caused a lot of fear in them. Yeah.
Yes, and you mentioned earlier that perhaps it is imposed by the perpetrator. This isolation from the support network could be a gradual phenomenon, but in the current COVID-19 climate, given that we move from circuit breaker where movement was restricted to phase one, where there was continued restriction of movement, and then now phase two, where slowly there is people are allowed to go out and socialize at pace across these phases. Have there been any trends that have emerged? Are these positive? They cause for concern? Because we would imagine that the isolation is no longer imposed by the perpetrator. It's actually given the curtailment measures taken by the government.
Yeah. Actually, it was really interesting and very worrying during the circuit breaker, because people were in the homes with the. If you were in a family violence relationship, you are in the home with the person who abuses 24/7, and you cannot get out of the house. So one of the things that we saw was an increase in the number of people calling for help. There was, I think, overall at that time, it started off with about 15%, and then it gradually increased. But what was also interesting was that post-COVID, we actually also started seeing an increase, and this was interesting because probably the people who couldn't get out to get help actually were able now to get help and came forward, right? But during the COVID times, the cases that we saw were very, very worrying, because they were intensive. The violence was very severe. We saw there was a surge of spousal violence cases. We saw a worrying and increasing trend of elder abuse cases, okay, because you'd find people who are unable to care for themselves and who are at the hands of a caregiver, sometimes got really badly hurt. But we also saw an increase in family disputes, which is not family violence. These were increased tensions. Child abuse actually increased also after COVID, after circuit breaker ended, because the children were now visible. They were coming out of their homes. They were going to schools, and so the issues started being raised to the school teachers and people around them. But all these things probably happened during the COVID break, during the circuit breaker itself.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's happening globally, isn't it? It's not just in Singapore that the number of cases that have gone up. I think there was a UN report as well that was published recently, and it showed that worldwide, and it's also not just the women that are making the complaints. I think it's also a fair number of the men. Yes. Okay,
Actually, at this point, Christine, I want to say thank you so much to all the social workers during this period, because amongst my colleagues or even friends-in-law, I think there was we were considered non-essential at that time, so we were still grappling with what we can do to help our clients. And at that point, many of us told them to contact organizations like PAVE and all, and they really stepped forward to help so many of them, and that's very heartening, and that they could get recourse to good help at that time. So I'd like to say thank you to all the social workers, if you're listening, for that extra work that you've put in to help so many of these victims.
Yes. And perhaps we can move on now to the next piece of the puzzle. We know that each family is different, and that to understand why family violence occurs or recurs, we first need to understand the familial relationships and the dynamics in each family. So Dr. Sudha, can you share with us what are some concerns that family violence survivors have that may cause them to tolerate abuse? And on the other side of the coin, what prompts perpetrators to persist with the abuse?
Okay, that's a really good question. There's always this assumption that people can leave a relationship if it is becoming unbearable. But in a family violence situation, these are people whom you love and you care for. And for a lot of the survivors, especially in a spousal violence kind of relationship, uh, you don't marry to divorce or you don't marry to break up. And the person
Right.
who is abusing you uh, has a loving side of him or her. I'm going to use her because more women are abused than men, but this doesn't discount the fact that there are men who also abuse, because this whole issue of family violence is about power and control. So whoever has the power, gender, irrespective of gender, would actually be could actually use that gender inappropriate the power inappropriately. So a lot of the times people tolerate because of shame. The fact that this is happening to them, and the assumption that people can just go out and seek a lawyer's help or go out to the police. There's a lot of restraint, because at the same time you don't want your family to know that this is happening. You don't want the children to be ashamed that the perpetrating person may be taken away by the police if you make a police report. You get messages that have been told to you by family members to say, don't make a big deal out of this. It happens in every family. So all these messages that people get actually keep them in the secret of the violence. And every time there is secrecy in violence, the violence intensifies. Also, some survivors have very strong religious beliefs, and sometimes there is a misinterpretation of the religion, and that's used by the person who abuses against the the survivor. And often when they seek help from people in their religious circle, the circle comes in to try to help. But the message that the survivor gets is, we will manage this within our own community, but things don't get any better. um, the other reason, which is quite interesting in a Singaporean context, in the Western context, this whole idea of economic dependence on the perpetrator or the person who abuses is very strong. And in Singapore, a lot of our women actually work, right? But where the economic dependence comes in is when they have to give their entire salaries to the person who abuses, and they then get a small allowance from which they are supposed to manage. So you may have like 3 children, you are given $10 a day or $20 a week, sometimes a day, sometimes a week, and you have to pay for the school expenses, get the food on the table, and so on. And some of the survivors tell us that they literally have to beg for money to get the family going. So there's this whole issue of economic dependence. Also, the messages that they get when they are making a report, like for example, sometimes they are asked things like, if your the spouse gets arrested, who is going to support the family? So those kinds of messages actually holds them back. But support in Singapore is quite easy to get, so that shouldn't be a reason why you don't reach out for help. The last point I'd like to make is about is transnational families, because one of the things that we saw during the circuit breaker was the number of transnational families who came forward, for help. Usually, a Singaporean man married to a foreign spouse, and they are very often on like long-term visit passes. So there's often the threat of canceling the long-term visit pass. There's often the threat that if you make a report, the child is Singaporean and I'm Singaporean, and so you won't get the child. So that also holds them back, and so these are some of the reasons why the survivors actually have many restraints before they take the first plunge to get help.
Yes, and I think, Dr. Sudha, the concerns that you raise, I mean, also as a practitioner, um, clients do raise these before, and they think long and hard about this before they finally bring themselves to a lawyer's office to seek help. Yeah, I'm sure Dharma, you could share later. I'm about to invite you to share actually.
Sure.
Some insight on the perspectives of survivors when they approach you for legal representation. What have their journeys been like before they, make the decision to seek legal recourse?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I mean, I like this question the most, because a lot of my family practitioners at the bar, a lot of us we're very wary to turn sometimes a family problem into a legal problem. You see, and even the courts take that view. Sometimes they do talk to us, and they have this whole approach towards um, applications like this because they want to see what are the underlying causes instead of just looking at the act of violence or the act that has brought them this far. And I think lawyers, as family lawyers, we tend to always ask, why have you been sustaining uh, this abuse? Why are you tolerating this behavior? And there's just a myriad of answers, cultural perspectives. I mean, we come from an Asian society. I've heard moms who tell me, my grandma was beaten, my mom was beaten. So, I didn't think me being beaten was such a big deal because they've seen this kind of pattern. And they say even my mom-in-law is abused by her husband. So I can understand why my husband does this. And then when I ask them, why are you finally here? They tell me because my I don't want my daughters to have that kind of a life in the future. So, and it's something as powerful as that will help them break the cycle. So, and I also, I know the women are the more common ones that come to mind when you talk about violence. But we've also seen like husbands who've tolerated some time, or men, even a brother in a family, who has tolerated maybe abuse from sisters, and they don't know how to come forward, and then they take time and they come, and even while they are at the lawyer's office, they are very unclear what are they doing there. They just want the violence to stop, but they think that, okay, so what does it do eventually? How does it? And many of them, what is interesting is they don't really want the perpetrator. I mean, I won't say perpetrator. I know the person that commits the violence to be punished. They just want the violence to stop because they still want to be part of the family. They still want that person in the family, and that's where it gets complicated. You see, then as lawyers, we have to see whether there is something we can do here. And then I guess later on, in during this session, we will actually talk about how even the law is aware of that, and has a multi-pronged approach to bring in counselors and all in the process of addressing family violence applications in court. Um, what I'd like to say here is that recently I've seen younger kids come to, when I say young kids, maybe past 20, they actually bring their parents, like their mom or dad, to see me, and they actually say things like, I'm going to get married and I'm going to move out of the house. I'm worried for my mom, and I want her to get this PPO, because she doesn't want to divorce my dad, but I want her to get it so she can feel protected with this, and the mom is the applicant, not her. So, but she really wants this because she feels helpless. Like, how do I help my mom here? I've always been at home. I've been protecting her, and now I'm going to leave the house, and I want this. So, and it's interesting because when I have these conversations with young people, I understand in schools now we have a different messaging. A lot of even girls' schools and all, they talk a lot about empowerment, liberation, and all that. So the kids are coming out now, trying to protect their families and all, and it's nice because it's why people even stay in these kind of abusive relationships, because there's some part of the family that they want to keep intact, because if they know if they take out something like this, um, they may break the family, or it may cause more tension. And people feel slighted when you take out a personal protection order. They don't get the message that you want the violence to stop. They actually think that, wow, you brought me to court. Yeah, okay, and then it becomes worse sometimes. So they are even aware of that, you see. And of course, later on, as we go on, it's good for them to know what a personal protection order is actually. It doesn't really punish anybody. It is an order that creates some obligation on the other party not to create that kind of sense of fear in you.
Yes, and actually what you have just shared, Dharma ties in nicely with our next point, which is
Okay.
when survivors of abuse are ready to take steps to protect themselves, then what
Right.
sort of protection is available and how do they obtain such protection?
Okay. Um, it's quite technical, but I'll try to make it as less dry as possible. So if anybody has um, they feel there's an act of violence on them, of course, it would be good if they do turn to counseling centers like PAVE, help centers like them, because they can address issues that before they go to court. That's what I mean. Before they go to court, they can address uh, maybe the other person that is not aware that their behavior is causing all this, or so that there can be some communication, some level of discussion before taking a legal recourse. But say the violence is very imminent, very strong, very uh, frightening, because that person is beyond communication. You can't really talk to them. Then of course they should take the step, go to court, and what the court will make an assessment. They make an application, and the court will make an assessment. If you are in some form of danger immediately, they will give you an expedited order. An expedited order is basically not saying that there is violence. It's just that they can see that you are feeling fearful, and you have some documentation to show that you have been hurt. So they will give them an expedited order while uh, this application is served on the other party before he can come to court to explain his version of what has happened. So in that period, and then expedited order lasts for about 28 days, right? And it has an expiry date in that sense. You see, so until you go to court, and then you get to say why you want this order, and if the other party uh, says no, I'm not agreeing to this, I'm not going to consent to this because that's not what happened, then of course the court is at liberty to extend the expedited order until the hearing, and then they will exchange affidavits and all, and then eventually at the hearing, if they succeed, uh, they get a personal protection order, and then if they don't, then the expedited order also expires at that point. You see, so that's the help they can get. um, there's also one called a domestic exclusion order, which is interesting because you can actually, if you have a shared residence, and if there are parties who feel unsafe in that residence, they can actually get an exclusion order to keep a particular person out of, say, a particular room. Say maybe the master bedroom will be a safe place. So if they go to the master bedroom, that other party cannot, the person who's committing the violence cannot enter that particular room. So that becomes like a safe place for them to go. And so the order will actually specify master bedroom, or in more serious cases, even the whole house. You see, so these kind of yeah. So the whole house is, for example, I mean, just to give you an anecdote, a case is like a gentleman comes home drunk every day. He has absolutely no control over himself and starts breaking this, breaking that, and creating a lot of ruckus. There are children in the house. People can't sleep. And it's such a daily pattern. You can't stop them. And every morning, maybe he says, I promise I won't do this again. And then that very night, he goes and does this, and there's just no way for the rest of the family to operate. So then they may want to take out a domestic exclusion order to keep that party away, so that maybe he can get the necessary help he wants. Yeah. Now
Yes.
the documents, yeah, the documents that you need to make these applications, would it would be useful to get a police report. I know. Dr. Sudha says for PAVE, it's not necessary sometimes to have all these things, but it will be good because you need to relate your story. A lot of victims tend to shut out a lot of these experiences and images. So when they go to police, they sit down, they actually have to document what really happened, date and time and all that. So that's good and useful because that's the flow. That's what you will have to be, and if you do it once, then you don't have to keep, because it's hard for them to retell the story to this person and then to the judge and to the lawyer, and then and they're having to defend themselves. So a police report is like a declaration. It's a and you've committed to that series of events, and it's good to do that at the police station. Of course, if you have I mean, the police will not immediately take action. It's just that you're making the report to say, I'm going to use this for, and of course, depending on the seriousness, they may also step forward to help. Uh, Medical reports are important because they also go to some extent to show what kind of help you may need. So the victim may, when they go and address, because sometimes they are abused and they think they can take it, and maybe the doctor says, no, this is really very serious, you've got this gash on your face, and it can, yeah, so you need to attend to it, and this kind of thing has to stop because you have sensitive skin, or you have you're anemic, so you cannot be losing blood. So these kind of things sometimes it's a good opportunity for them to have a wake up call that they need to actually stop. So seeing a doctor and all these are, I mean, it's still self-help, instead
Yes.
of being in a state of denial.
Yeah.
The court process, like I was explaining just now, is multi-pronged now. I think all personal protection order applications or even domestic exclusion order applications, the court also orders a counseling order. They put a counseling order in place. So even if parties come forward and say, yeah, I did it, and then they consent into a PPO, they consent to the order, the court still orders counseling order, because parties need to address. I mean, it's not the end, right? Getting a personal protection order is not the end of the problem. There may be other underlying problems, and it's heartening to know the courts are aware of that, and in line with therapeutic justice, in line with seeing a family problem as a family problem and not just a legal, problem. It's good that parties attend. So if they feel, oh, I've got the personal protection order, I don't need to talk to the counselor already, I feel very safe now. No, I think that parties should actually go for the sessions, find out a bit more, try to find some closure, so that they don't so that this pattern can be diluted, it fades away over time, or things like that. And all this, the documents I was talking about, like medical report and all, will be useful if the other party denies all this violence. And so when you have to put an affidavit together, these documents will come into use for that. And then you don't have to recall. As days go on, you might forget exactly what happened. And because you have to show more than one incident, right? The more a
Yeah.
continuum of incidents, it's good to record all these things down.
So Dharma, I think for
Uh,
sorry, just to interrupt, the documents, required, of course, for the medical report, that would be very helpful and relevant.
Right.
If the abuse suffered is physical abuse. We have a question from the audience about
Okay.
psychological abuse, because given the very nature of that sort of abuse, it is difficult to have any physical evidence. And
Sure.
I think just to assist this participant, the question is are there any strategies that the panelists suggest for those suffering psychological abuse? I guess it is in the context of providing adequate documentation for the PPO to be filed.
Sure. I think okay, for like children, sometimes the school counselors are good. They come forward and they say, I spoke to so and so, and the school counselors actually can come up with a little bit of a report or something to say, or alert the parent, because sometimes the child himself says, actually my mom is beating me, but my dad wants to help me, but he doesn't know how. And then they actually say this, and then the counselor knows, okay, I'm going to reach out to the dad, and see how I can help. And so that's a kind of a way of getting some kind of evidence, if at all they want to go down that path. um, Even seeing a counselor or a psychologist, and I think Dr. Sudha will be able to enlighten us, when actually they come through them and then get a PPO, they do I'm going to risk it and say it, risk assessment test, right? Which, lawyers can't say it, but lawyers don't do that. But, they'd have a risk assessment test. And that's also, I think, very useful as a documentation to show, okay, this person is clearly, it's largely the effect on the victim, is that psychological abuse, like making her not go to work, is she going into depression, and things like that. And how best can we diagnose this unless we have somebody, an expert, a third party person saying that, in a report. So that kind of report that says, oh, you're clinically depressed, you need help and all that. I mean, of course, it's going to be hard to point it to that person, but it could be the environment she's in, and that has caused her, and then we try to make the link that way. So if you are trying to take a strategy to have, I mean, I understand, because even in our courts, it's important to have uh, overwhelming evidence, because the court is hesitant to give out the protection order so easily, because, like I said, it has its not say consequences, it has its implications to that family. Giving a protection order, it can distance people in the family more rather than bring them closer, you see. So they do keep the bar very high to show that violence. Maybe Dr. Sudha can also
Yeah,
explain about
yeah,
this
Christine,
idea.
I think that's a really good question. I think documentation is very important for a person who's going through psychological violence. Like, for example, so in some cases, like for example, if the person who abuses is making threats, so keeping tab on all those things. When did it happen? What actually happened? Like keeping a kind of a diary of sorts, you know. Uh, and psychological abuse. When we talk about the whole continuum of violence and the whole cycle of violence, uh, as I said earlier, physical comes across very obviously because you can see the bruises. But actually, the psychological abuse is worse than the physical abuse because it's so psychologically debilitating sometimes that they really cannot move. So somebody using threats, for example, I remember a case where the person who abuses never hit the family at all. But what he would do was to cut himself and then smear the blood on the wife and the children. And so these kinds of psychological means, the following them everywhere, you're always walking on eggshells because don't know where they are going to turn up. You don't know what's going to happen next. So I think documentation is very important. One of the things I think, one of the reasons why people continue to stay is because of love and hope. So you always hope that the person will change because sometimes they are really nice and then sometimes they are not. And so there's always that hope. So whether it's physical abuse or whether it's psychological abuse, documentation is very important. That's the first thing. The second thing I think is, remember we talked about violence being a secret. To stop violence, you have to break the secret. So you have to tell somebody about it. And that would be your corroborating evidence. Like for example, if you're working and your husband is standing outside your office, to tell somebody, he's standing outside the office, and so that other people begin to know about it. We've had cases where because of this documentation and because the client was able to give very specific details like 10 times calling during the session. We had a case where actually as the client was walking to our office, the husband first called the wife up and said, I know you're walking on this road near this block, and then calls us up and says, yeah, I know my wife is coming to your block. So those kinds of things, he didn't do anything physical, but it is very frightening, to know that you don't have any privacy at all. So psychological abuse actually is even worse than physical abuse, and we really need to pay attention to it.
Yes. Okay. I suppose that's why we had the question, because as someone who is suffering psychological abuse, I guess the common difficulty they have is, how do I prove it? It's invisible, and even if I tell someone, is my family member going to say, oh, it's imagined, and there's conspiracy against me? And
Yeah,
so thank you.
Christine, yeah, there was this one client we had. Now I think when you send text messages, you can actually delete them, right? So
Yeah.
her partner will send all these text messages, and then she sees them and it hurts her, and then he's deleting them it before her, and she can't even like save it to show anybody or anything. And that's a kind of like psychological abuse, I understand. And then she went into this pattern where every time he sends something, she starts doing the screenshot on her phone, and trying to do it quickly and all, and this is during her work hours and all that, so that she's got some kind of evidence. And that's very debilitating. And because he does it, and then nobody knows that he's done this to her, and it affects them. So
Christine, can I add on to that, to say that, early on, we're always talking about spousal violence, but actually there's a whole range of family violence, right? I mean, I think Dharma mentioned about sibling abuse, right? You have elder abuse. You have young adults in their maybe 18, 20 to about 25, 26, abusing their young parents who are under 55. Then you have the parents, abusing adult children. And in all this different kinds of abuse, the different target populations, you have the same thing. It's not always physical. It's not always, sometimes it's things like it's money. It's related to money, like with elder abuse. You find that the elderly, gives is told by a family member that come and stay with me. I'll take care of you. Why don't you help me to buy the house, sell your house, and you can stay with me. And then after that, they get kicked out of the house. Sometimes psychologically they are denied medication. Sometimes even your ATM card or your pioneer, the pioneer generation card taken away from them because they don't want them to go and seek medical help. So how do you prove this if you don't tell anybody what's happening? So documentation and breaking that secret is really very, very important. So I wanted to also add to that by saying that the national family there's a national family violence networking system in Singapore, where there are different touch points for people to either receive help or for professionals to know that there are these places where they can pick up things. So for example, a child in school can be showing a certain behavior, and then the school teacher, because they are trained to pick up these things, could actually do an assessment and then immediately flag the case up to child protection services or to the child protection specialist centers. Okay, a doctor and a medical social worker going to a person who goes to the hospital just for some other ailment, a doctor can pick it up and say, and by asking questions, find out that, like for example, somebody attempts suicide. Okay, so the presenting issue is attempted suicide, right? But when they go to hospital and they are gathering the information, the medical social workers come into the picture, and they actually find out that actually the attempted suicide was just a way to stop the violence. They just couldn't take this anymore, and they thought, okay, enough, I just want to end my life. So there are all these touch points in various places in Singapore where professionals actually pick up cases and encourage the person to come and seek help. So for example, police are fantastic at doing this. When they are called for a 999 call, or they make their home visits, the community police, for example, they make the home visits, and they actually have on their radar homes where they've heard about family violence, and these homes are on their radar. And sometimes they go up to the person who is a survivor and say, I think you need help. Here's a place that you can go to for help, and they give that contact number. So I think reaching out to these to people, to survivors of violence, is very important. They may not be ready to come forward and get help at the point at which you are trying to help them, but giving that information is very empowering for them. When they are ready, they will come forward. One of the things that we really shouldn't do is to tell them what to do, because they're not ready. And if you think about this whole concept of family violence, which is very disempowering, because family violence actually tells the person that, you're not good enough. Eventually, the survivor, be it male or female, child or adult, after a while, you lose your sense of self, so it's very disempowering. So what then so if they come to you as a professional and you tell them you must get a PPO, you must get out of the house, you must go and leave this person, or don't allow your child to treat you like this, it's very hard to push somebody to make that decision, and if you do that, it can actually backfire, because they go and apply for the PPO, and then when they go to court, they tell the court, actually I didn't want, but my social worker told me to do it, and so it's really, how do you pace with them and wait until they are ready, and empower them, and if you are there to handhold them through that process, eventually they do come and take action.
Yes, actually, thank you, Dr. Sudha. That's a very nice prelude to our one of the topics we have down the road, actually, on how to help survivors of abuse. We have a steady stream of questions coming in from our audience. Don't fret, we will deal with most of them we'll try to do with most of them. Otherwise, you can contact Dr. Sudha and Dharma. But perhaps just to wrap up the protection point, Dharma, I think you were about to share with us how the courts will be satisfied, or rather, what needs to be satisfied before a PPO is granted. And there is also a member's question, an audience question from the audience on whether or not the EPO is whether the EPO is made pursuant to a PPO application, or is there a separate application that needs to be made. So grateful if you could
Sure,
answer that.
I'll answer the EPO one. And an EPO is basically when you make the application in court, uh, and you have established that there is some pattern of violence, and you're worried to go back and all that. So the court knows, okay, because that document is going to be served on the other party by the court process server that evening or the next day. So they are worried. Oh no, I've made this application. He's going to get a document. What happens? I go home and it beats me up because the PPO hearing is you put the mention 2 weeks later. So in this 2 weeks, how do I protect myself? So the EPO facilitates that. It covers that gap. It takes care of that time. So where you're walking back home now, and then that EPO is available for you to activate in the event the gentleman or the woman or whoever's at home who's going to receive the court documents that a PPO application has been taken out on you. And here's a copy of the EPO. So please don't commit any violence until the mentioned date. So the EPO is there as a protection for them, so that if anything happens, they can call the police. Uh, I'm going to latch onto that point. There are some of my clients who've shared with me that once they get a PPO, they actually stop by the police post to say, I finally taken out this application. I've got an EPO. I don't need, I hope I don't have to use it, but I'm just letting you know I'm going back and he's going to be served this document. I am worried he will just lose it and get angry. So, I will call you if I need any help, but if you could just come by my block or something and just keep an eye this evening, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing because that's quite good of them to even already start on that process of looking for good help around them, because the hearing is another date. The court will have to deal with it. I hope that satisfies that question on EPO.
Thank
The
you.
court, yeah, the court has a two-limb test, you see. But I want to caveat this. Ultimately, it's a very contextual exercise. The court has to look at the circumstances of everything. So though I say the two-limb, it doesn't mean, okay, I've got this, I should be getting the PPO. It's still a very contextual exercise. The court will have to use its discretion to understand the value of this PPO to this particular case. So the court has to be satisfied violence has been committed, and it shouldn't be a one-off incident. It must be a kind of behavior, because I explained earlier, right, that there are 4 types of violence that can be committed. So it's not so it's not like a category that you can clearly say, because like Dr. Sudha says, it could be just a combination of behavior that has caused this. So the court must be satisfied that there's this continuum, or this more than one pattern has happened. It must be in the recent past, all right, and also the necessity, whether it's necessary. So for example, you are living in the same house as this person, so the necessity limb is more or less obviously taken care of. But there are some people who, after they have been beaten by the family member or they've been abused, they move out of the house and they don't ever intend to come back because they've taken out a divorce application or they are making plans to leave the country. So there's no necessity in that sense, because they're not going to come across this person in the future, you see. So then the court will also have to weigh and see whether, okay, I'm satisfied there's violence, that you have proven that part, but going forward, what would a protection order do for you if you're not going to come across this person anymore? You see, so that limb also has to be satisfied. So sometimes to protect yourself, you leave the house. So it's something that cuts both ways, lah. You leave the house, but then you might have to tell the court, you know what, after I get the order, I am planning to move back into the house. So I need this, so the necessity is the second limb, and sometimes that is the harder one to prove. It may look like the first one is the harder one, but once you've crossed that, you also have to try and satisfy the court that it is necessary for you. Yeah.
And if the court does order a PPO, how long is the order valid for?
Okay, a PPO doesn't have it's actually a permanent order because it doesn't really have an expiry date. Having said that, I've also seen PPOs for a specific time period. Uh, I don't know personally why the judge may have decided to do that, because I've seen it, so I don't know. But maybe because that person will be leaving, or they are getting the necessary help, or but I'm sure there's some because if it's permanently on the record, it also hampers the chance of reconciliation of these two family members, because it's
Yes.
got that perpetual effect, and and a party can feel like there's no point me trying to be nice to you because you always have that PPO against me, like I'm a violent person, so that can hamper it. So maybe there was that kind of logic in that PPO. So I mean, a duration PPO is also sometimes has its own sense of there's meaning to that, but
Mm.
basically all PPOs don't have an expiry date. They are just meant for you to be protected. And
Mm.
like I said, the bar
Sorry,
is
can
high.
I
Sorry.
Yes. Sorry, can I jump in here? Because I have a slightly different take on the PPO not being a tool to break up families. Actually, I see it as a
Okay.
means to
Sure.
reintegrate families.
Sure.
Mm.
Because basically the message that we are sending out is that this is not tolerated. And at this
Right.
point, it is really it's really the court telling you do not use abuse.
Mm.
It is not a document to say we are going to throw you in jail now that you've got a PPO. It's the breach of the PPO that throws you in jail.
Sure.
But
Sure.
it's really a message to the person to say violence is not tolerated in Singapore, and
Mm.
we are giving you an opportunity not to use this behavior. So that
Okay.
together with the mandatory counseling order then becomes very important, because
Mm.
people should not think that mandatory counseling or taking out a PPO means that there's going to be a breakup in family ties. In fact,
Sure.
what we tell our clients is that it's actually a means for you to get help and to bring help into the family.
Mm.
So often what happens is that and let me share with you the PAVE perspective. Different agencies
Mm.
may see it differently, but
Sure.
sometimes when a wife goes and or when a person takes, whether wife or brother or sister, takes out or is planning to take out a PPO, and we ask the person who is applying for the applicant, would it be helpful for us to call the person who used abuse, and if they say yes, and they are, or sometimes they tell us, let me take out the PPO first, then you call, right? And then we call the other person to say, look, you're going to be served the summons, and tell us your side of the story, and let's see how we can keep you from getting into trouble, because now if you choose to use violence, you can get into trouble. And then invite them for counseling. So I think that whole counseling process is actually really helpful. We have actually at PAVE we run groups for survivors, we run groups for people who use abuse, and we run groups for children, because children are very traumatized by what's happening, so the entire family can get help if they choose to go to a family violence specialist center or a child protection specialist center or any of the 47 family service centers in Singapore. At PAVE, we offer an integrated service. So the one person could go one person sees the social worker for the abusive behavior, another person sees the social worker for the recovery, and then another one may see the children, right?
Mm.
But what also happens is that after the violence stops, and let's say it's a spousal violence case, or even an elder abuse case, after the violence stops, then the family is offered an opportunity to work on their family issues. So if it's a marital issue, we offer them the opportunity to work on their marital issues, or we offer them the opportunity to work on the family issues. If it's a sibling violence kinds of issue. But let's say the survivor decides that, no, I don't want to work on the marital issues. I want to move on. Right? Then there is also that element of how do you get the other party to let go, because there's a lot of grief, that the family is breaking up, and
Right.
and how do you prepare the children? How do you prepare the person who uses abuse? So that's part of the counseling work that's also done in many social service agencies. So the entire family gets help, and so I think the PPO is really a means to, if we can also tell people that it's a means to help to repair families rather than just break up families.
Sure.
Yes.
No, that's good, Dr. Sudha, because yeah, I take that point. But I mean, we've had some cases, it because it's, yeah, you're right. It's, I don't tolerate this kind of abuse anymore. That's the signal you're sending. But sometimes we get parties who come to us, or women who feel like this is the last straw, and then the PPO is just the precursor to the divorce,
Yes, yes,
because they're just doing it to protect themselves, because the divorce process may take some
yes.
time, and then they're looking for a lawyer or something. So they tend to, it's tagged, sometimes like that, or they do it because it will help them uh, establish a ground for divorce, for example. You see, and that's the part I find sometimes, it shouldn't be used like that. But yeah, there are people who
Mm,
do it, and many people. I mean, sometimes and sometimes this is the more educated ones. When a PPO application is taken out, they are so slighted by the entire exercise that they have been brought to court and all that. And I've also heard some social workers share with me how it's so hard to recruit them into the counseling process because they are like,
mm,
I already gave her the PPO, I already consented. What do you want me to talk to you for? What, And then that distance is there, and and that's sad. So if people can start seeing it as, it's just because a PPO is not a charge against you to go to prison for the violence you've committed. It's just
mm.
someone saying, don't do this anymore, please. I,
Stop
I
the
cannot take
violence.
it.
Yeah.
You see, yeah, I can't take it.
Mm,
And that's a cry for help rather than, like what you say, anything else. It's not an empowering piece of document that makes her automatically have high self-esteem, or
Okay.
so it is. Yeah,
Mm.
it's
Um,
equally hard for a person to make that application. Yeah.
yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, we do
Yeah.
we do have a number of questions coming in about how we can change the social norm, so that people will not feel afraid to ask for help. Yeah, but we'll
mm.
get to those later. Sorry, Dharma, what happens
Yes.
if a perpetrator continues to inflict violence after a PPO is granted? Are there any, or rather, what options are available to the survivor for recourse?
Yeah, this is where the PPO application becomes quasi-criminal in that sense. You see,
Mm,
because once you breach the order is like it's a seizable offense already. So once
mm,
you breach it, there are consequences when you call the police.
mm,
A first-time offender can be fined up to 2,000, be put in prison, or both.
mm,
Depending on the severity of that. So breaching the PPO has very serious consequences that
mm,
invoke the CPC, the Criminal Penal Code, in that
mm,
sense, and
mm,
that's an important thing for people to know. So
mm,
to get the counseling help to address the issues that you may have, whether they are uh, uh, your own frustrations, your own way of dealing with people, or your own way of communicating, is important, because if you're not going to address that and you just fly off the handle because your food is not hot enough, or your shirt is not
yeah.
ironed properly, and and it's an impulsive reaction, and you don't even realize you're breaching the PPO at that point, it can be quite the consequences are very strong, and that, I think, at that part, the relationship becomes more and more irreparable. It
Yes.
becomes harder for social workers to work on the family. Yeah.
Mm.
So getting help, is important. Yeah.
Mm. And Dr. Sudha, on the what social support services are available to help survivors of abuse? I think you mentioned earlier that there will be a risk assessment, there will be counseling. Is there anything else you could share with us about the support services that are available?
Yeah. Um, so I think most of the 47 family service centers, and so we have 47 family service centers, and we have two family violence specialist centers and
Mm,
two child protection specialist center, and PAVE is an integrated service. It offers both child
okay.
protection and family violence and the whole gamut of services around that. Okay, so in the family violence specialist centers, one of the support services that we have is actually for people to apply for protection orders. They don't need to go to the family court. They can actually come to a family violence specialist center or to a PAVE, and the good thing about this is that the counseling starts almost immediately. So the moment they step in, a social worker is already documenting what has happened, helping them to put together their story. Right. So I think, as Dharma said just now, in the PPO application, there are two questions that are asked. One is the current event, and the next one is the history of violence. So sometimes the latest event was not very serious, but the history is really very serious, and the judges actually look at that as well. So the counseling services take place, and then we offer to contact the other party and invite them if they want to come in voluntarily, right? So in the process of the work that we do, we also assessing for trauma, right? We are also assessing the risk level. So is it very high risk, very low risk? Then we put in services to wrap around the family. If there are children involved, then we also have trauma services that are available. Quite a number of social service agencies actually provide trauma services for children. At PAVE, we have specially trained people to do this. And then we also take the mandatory counseling cases that the court sends. And one of the things that we have been very happy that we have developed is actually programs for people who use abuse. Because it's very good to help survivors and to help them, and they really need the help. But for violence to stop, it is the person who uses abuse that needs the most help. And I always remember this one survivor. I guess he was also a survivor of violence who told us that how he saw the abuse as a child, and then as he grew up, he started hitting his father, and then he started abusing his wife. And one day he had pinned his wife against the wall when his 4-year-old son came up and shouted, "Daddy, what are you doing?" And he said, he actually swore that he would never become like his father. And there he was doing exactly what his father did. So I think providing services for persons who abuse is really important. And a lot of the male persons who abuse, who have come through our program, actually now are like our ambassadors. They actually bring in other people like them, and also help us out in our group work programs for people who use abuse as well. So I think the support services are both ways, not just for the survivors, but also for the persons who use abuse and the children and family members, if it is not spousal violence but other kinds of violence.
Yeah. So the help is really for the entire family.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll be moving on to address actually help for both survivors and the perpetrators. Perhaps we can start first. Questions for Dharma. Okay, now we know that family violence can happen to anyone and at any time. What should a survivor do on his or her own after suffering abuse? You earlier mentioned that a PPO application should be filed with a police report and medical report. Is it necessary to wait until these are ready before applying for a PPO?
Not necessarily. I mean, you can make the PPO application without these reports, but it will be good. Like I said, it's good to. I mean, ultimately, it's an evidentiary burden that the applicant has in court to show that something has happened to me, and we have to weed out. Unfortunately, some of the applicants who cry wolf. That we also have that small segment of people who use the PPO application as a tool to just bully their husbands or some family members. So making a police report is a big step, because they have to address and talk. So these kind of things just help us understand that clearly this person is trying to put together her own case. See, and that's important, because uh, sometimes they come to a lawyer, and then we're lawyers, we'd like to be counselors, we try to be, and most of us end up being sometime some kind of counselor.
Yeah,
But
2 in 1.
and yeah, and and we want to help them take it forward, which is why we try to keep it at a. And sometimes we do send them back to, why don't you go to the family service center to talk, or get a police report done, because we also want to know that you are you're committed to doing this taking this application, taking this step forward, you see. So
Yeah.
because it's a journey towards the PPO application,
Yeah.
towards getting the PPO order. So
Mm.
putting these kind of things in place also shows some kind of like your little milestones. I've done it. I've gone and talked to someone.
Yeah.
Like Dr. Naya says, break the
Yeah.
secret, talk about it to someone, not just come and just talk to the lawyer. And then we have, of course, solicitor client confidentiality. So it remains a secret. So
Yeah.
go out there, put it out on a police report, get the medical help, and why that helps, it helps you, I'm sure, on your journey. And also, it
Mm.
helps the lawyer, because like what Dr. Sudha Nair says, can you imagine going to court and then they say things like, actually my lawyer told me I should take out this application, and then we are like,
Mm.
and of course at that moment when I see you so abused, and I think you need to get out of it, that would be the right thing to do. But
Mm.
now that there are so many, the stigma is down, there's a lot of social help out there, there's a lot of people who are more aware of these things, they're able
Mm.
to document your problems for you. um,
Mm.
Even
Mm.
calling out for people at home, for example, I had a client who had a daughter who always took pictures of her mom, you know of her bruises, and that documentation was very interesting, because the photos had the date and the time. So even if it was a fuzzy thing for her in her
Mm.
mind, over time,
Mm.
what were all the abuses, the daughter's photo text messages to her mom became a good chronology of what had happened. And asking for even help at home, even if both of you feels frightened of the father or the male in the house, at least
Mhm.
doing a documentation, because it gets fuzzy for the victim,
Yeah.
really, because it all goes into a blur, because
Yeah.
they're, I think, conflicted in shutting down the experience, and then trying to understand it, and then trying to get help, and then maybe it didn't happen, and today he's very nice, so I will forget him.
Mm.
So it all becomes a bit of a blur. So to get somebody outside the violence itself to sort of assist you
Mhm.
is good. I mean, it's not easy for someone who's a victim to go and jot down, okay, today he beat me, and is this time, and I have this bruise, and it's not easy. So to get
Mm.
that kind of even help, or like Dr. Nice says, talk to a friend,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
get that kind of an objective view that this is right or wrong, or things like that. Yeah.
Mm.
So yeah, I think that's how they should try and get immediate help uh,
Mm.
for
Okay.
their problems.
And then on to our next discussion point on how to help a survivor of abuse, whether as an ally, as a neighbor, as a co-worker. Dr. Sudha, I know you did touch on it earlier, but how can we approach survivors of abuse and encourage or empower them to act against the perpetrators? Are there any sensitivities to be mindful of when we are trying to offer help? I think this is a question that quite a number of our audience members are interested in, because they are family members, they are co-workers, they are neighbors, and they observe. And I think we have a question from a member as well. He described his situation as such. Psychological abuse has actually been, occurring over years, but there's been a decrease in intensity in recent times. But there are still occasional episodes of flaring up. But the victim has no means or resources to seek help. So how perhaps you could share with us what would be the best way to approach survivors of abuse?
First of all, I'd like to say that it doesn't cost anything to seek help. Okay, all the services are funded by government. So if you
Mm.
approach a social service agency, some of them may
Right.
charge, but it's very minimal. But a lot of us don't. So they can just come forward, and help will be provided. Okay.
Mm.
Um, let me talk about how to be a good ally, whether you are a member of the family, or an employer, because we get a lot of people, who are employers actually bringing their employees to us for help because they are worried, right? Or we get a lot of calls from neighbors telling us that there's somebody screaming from this house, and we send people then to go. One of the things that you can do to help is to be very mindful and watchful of what is happening. Like somebody for example, who was very gregarious, and then suddenly you notice changes in behaviors. If
Mm.
you notice that they are maybe losing weight, or they appear very nervous when the person who abuses comes, tries to cover their bruises. Sometimes, and some some people who use violence are very clever. They actually hit them in places that cannot be seen. You know, so but occasionally you will get a bruise somewhere, you know. So if you notice them trying to stop uh, to, to to cover bruises, or sometimes, you know, getting very nervous when the person appears, you know, turning up at the office, you know, suddenly, and for you to ask questions, you know, tell them, you know, is anything going on, you know, would you like to talk, you know, and try to create a conversation without pushing them, you know. Every now and again, just checking with them, how are you doing, you know, how are you doing. Sometimes we get clients who are referred to us, and you know, they really don't want help, you know, but because we are very persistent in just calling up once in a while to say, is everything okay, you know, just call to see how you check in on you, or we are passing by their home and we drop in to say, oh, I was just passing by, you know, how are you doing. To show that kind of care and concern makes a big difference, you know.
Right.
Because at some point they will start talking. So that's one of the things that they can do, right? So if it's a family member, you know, if they are absent from social events that the family is having, you know, and you don't get to see them for months, you know, so that those are things that you should be aware of, you know. Changes in children's behavior, you know, you notice that they're not going to school regularly, you know, or somebody calls you up and says, you know, your nephew is has missed school, you know, can you go and find out what's going on. Always always be aware of the mental state of the person, because, you know, like I said, readiness is really important. Sometimes just giving them information, like what Dharma said about, you know, applying for a PPO, going to the police and asking for help, or you know, uh, going to a social service agency, you know. Actually, what we find really very useful is when we have brochures at CCs, or little contact numbers that you give somebody, and tell them, you know, use this number when you are ready. There are people there who can help you. Then when they are ready, they will call, you know. So readiness actually is very important, you know. And sometimes if you have this frustration that, you know, you really want to help, and then you actually do help, and then they keep going back again and again, you know. uh, Sometimes it's actually because they are actually surviving, they are trying to survive, you know, because leaving actually is actually more dangerous. People always
Right.
think that divorce and leaving is actually the best thing, but actually it's more dangerous because the violence increases, you know. If you're pregnant and you are trying to leave and they catch hold of you, then pregnancy is also another high risk time, you know, because if you get hurt, then that unborn baby is also hurt, you know.
Right.
um, so, but you know, if you think about a survivor, and that's why I like the term survivor, because they really are surviving. You know, they have to hold a job, they have to look after the children, they have to deal with the abuse. You know, and I'm talking about both males and females. You know, not just spousal violence, any kind of violence. You actually have to survive. So it takes a lot of strength. You know, so having somebody there to walk with you until you are ready actually becomes very important. So one of the things that I'd really like to give a big shout out to is for neighbors in the community to alert social service agencies, you know, call up a specialist center and say, I'm hearing screaming from this house, this unit number, you know, and we will go, you know, and check it out, you know, informing your MP, you know, that something is going on, or informing the community police that I keep hearing this, just call them up, or, you know, and say, I'm hearing this. Family violence should be a community responsibility and not a private family problem. So I think all of us have a responsibility to break that secret, you know, and provide that help. So we have to be that lifeline for people who can't step forward, you know,
Right.
and recognize that we offer help. At some point, they are going to reach out, but we are there for them when they are ready.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Yeah.
Sudha.
Yeah.
Sorry, Dama, would you like to add on?
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, sometimes it's, you know, one of the tools I've learned over time is when you're sitting in front of someone and you're trying to, you know, they're going through something and they're unable to talk. It's always good to share something about, instead of asking like, what's wrong? I can see something is wrong. You're not smiling. Yesterday you were smiling. Today you're not. You know, instead of badgering them, is to even share with them. something you are going through, or even, so just to start opening up the conversation so that they, you put yourself a little vulnerable, that person also maybe starts opening up. And I find this tool very useful sometimes, because sometimes I have, they come and see a lawyer and they think, we have a very different kind of relationship. So sometimes I even ask them, what do you think is a good marriage? What do you think is a good, what would you say is an ideal husband? And then when they start talking, things come out, and that's a good way to get them to first acknowledge that they are surviving a kind of abuse, and I and that will be a good breakthrough, because it's hard when you just keep questioning them, and then they just suddenly feel like, oh, but I better not say anything, because this, yeah. So yeah, that's a good tool to put yourself out there, also to be part of the conversation with them. And I like Dr. Naya's point. Yeah, it is a community. A lot of us see it as, this is their family problem, it's their domestic, how can we go and interfere, and this is a cultural thing that we've all grown up with. And we should sometimes, if we really see something very daunting, something disturbing, we should have some moral courage to try and help them, because we are helping, even their children or their other family members. And that's important.
Yeah, definitely. Taking things a step further, how can we help a perpetrator get the help he or she needs to prevent escalation or recurrence of family violence? Dr. Sudha, could you share from your experience how PAVE has helped families through such issues?
Okay. First of all, I want to say that a lot of the people who use violence are not bad 24/7. There is this loving side of them. They can be loving husbands, they can be loving fathers, they can be loving sons. So they're not bad 24/7, and we need to recognize that part of it. But having said that, I also would say that, if somebody doesn't want to change, no amount of counseling is going to help. But if they are willing to come forward and recognize that there is a problem, and that there are professionals who can help them, then I think the change process starts. The change doesn't start with a sorry, I won't do it again. It is, the change starts with or give me another chance. The change starts with, I need help. And I know I can't do this myself, and I don't want to break up the family. So a lot of the persons who come forward and get help are people who realize that actually by their behavior their family is breaking up, and they really don't want the breakup of the family. So although the change process is not easy, especially when you come in through so there are two routes, right? You have the mandatory counseling route, which is wonderful because the court sends them. So we actually have the mandate from the court to say he's very cooperative or he's not cooperative, or she's not cooperative.
Right.
But what we also find is that in the first like 3 to 4 sessions, there's a lot of anger and resentment, because our laws to help families who are experiencing abuse is called the Women's Charter. So if you get a male who is the person who uses violence, even though the Women's Charter is not only for women, it's for everyone.
Right.
It's that whole idea that, woman judge, woman police officer, woman's counselor, and then,
Woman lawyer.
woman lawyer. So there is always that idea that the world is against me, so you will get all the restraints from them, But if you can sit through that, and point out to them that, look, this behavior is not helping you, at the end of the day, if nothing changes, you're going to lose this family, and think about the impact that this is having on your children. And so a lot of the persons that we have, the persons who abuse that we have worked with, actually, when they have come forward and they have accepted accountability and responsibility for their behaviors, then the change process starts. So I think mandatory counseling, which is being paid for by government, is a fantastic opportunity for people who actually want to keep their families together, and want to save their families. And if they can't save, if they get into another relationship, they would have learned a new way of doing things, because in the counseling process, the negative behavior is taken out, and they learn new behaviors. So basically, violence is learned behavior. So if you learn something, you can also unlearn it. and learn new things, and so that's what the whole process is all about.
Thank you, Dr. Suja. I think we have some people may have concerns and they're not certain if they fall into the perpetrator category. But I mean, this is a myth, isn't it, Dr. Suja?
Actually, thinking about violence and coercive control as being a temper problem or an anger management problem is a common mistake. And often we get people who refer clients to us for anger management, but I think it misses the entire point, which is the impact of the violence on the people around them. Okay, so these people don't use violence on their bosses, they don't use them on their friends, they don't use them on on their acquaintances, but the target is the family member. So it's a choice that they are making. They are making a choice to use violence on somebody whom they care about. So how can it be an anger management problem? If you have an anger management problem, then you'll be angry all the time, not just with one particular person. So I think we need to get people to recognize that really it's about taking responsibility for the choices that you make. You choose to use violence, and therefore you can choose to stop.
Maybe this discussion for Dharma: when does an act committed in anger cross the line and become abusive?
I think when the other person is in fear, or they have been hurt, and it's largely the impact on themselves that is more important. Some women can take it; they can take the incessant shouting of their husband, or some men can take the incessant nagging of their wife. And they really don't think, even if they say, "I'm going to kill you," it means nothing to the husband because she says that every day about 10 times, and she's not going to kill me, you're aware of it. But if it is said with that malice, it's said with that intention to put that person in his or her place, to create that kind of fear, then I think that that you've crossed the line. Coming back to that point about anger management, also, that there's also this passive aggression. There are some people who can commit violence in a very cool way, like locking your things and locking you out of the house, and they're just cool about it. They're not screaming or shouting, or disabling your computer, or like making it difficult for you to even function in your own home, and all this is a kind of uh, abuse in that house. You see, it affects them. So it's not, I mean, when we say family violence, it's always not. I know the images we always show is someone really like dominant and angry, their demon-like image and all that. But no, I think over time, people have found very different sophisticated ways to commit family violence. You see, I mean, I know we've heard words like gaslighting, or some women even come and tell me, oh, he is suffering from narcissistic personality disorder. I mean, I am no expert in all these things, but obviously some of my clients have read very widely and extensively about these things, and they seem to already know these are the issues I'm facing, because you can never tell, because he's really a gentleman out there. He talks to everybody very nicely, and but at home, I don't know why when it comes to me, he treats me like I'm invisible, or he doesn't, so I guess it's recognizing. Sometimes it's hard, Dr. Nair, for even some people to like, me, what's wrong with me? I'm okay, what, like she's the one with the problem.
But that's precisely it. That's the intent, you see, that they're using that negative behavior to put someone down, and then she or the survivor then looks like the person who's totally out of control, and the person who uses violence is in control. But the very fact that he's in control actually tells you that it's not about anger, isn't it? Because if he's out of control, then he doesn't know what he's doing, but he's very much in control. And if you look at the we have in our program, we have something that's called the escalation of violence. Sometimes the person who uses abuse will tell us things like, actually, I didn't know what I was doing. Suddenly I lost my cool. But when we track the violence, and we show them that actually this was an escalation. It started yesterday because you were angry about something, and then it built up and built up and built up, and then one small trigger, and then you exploded. So the intent is very. We started this conversation where we talked about intent. So actually they are very much in control, not out of control.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
so yeah, it is a myth, this anger issue, because we have lately seen more different types of
Mm.
people who committed different types of, stylistically, in different ways. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, time has flown by. Dr.
Yes.
Sudha, have you any last words for family members who want to help perpetrators understand that their behaviors may be bordering on abusive behavior?
Come forward and speak to someone about it. Come forward to seek professional help, and work with the professionals to see how we can bring the person in. But can I make one last point about the impact of violence on children? Because I think that's a really important issue. There's always this assumption that children don't know, or don't hear what's going on in the family. Like sometimes they will tell us things like, oh, the children were in the bedroom, so they don't know what's going on. But actually, the impact on children is really long lasting. And I think if you all had been following the report by IMH recently, the the impact on not just on children who are physically abused, but also witnessing violence can have long-term consequences on the child. I think the IMH study actually told us that that if a person living with a mother who is abused is 2 times more likely to suffer from a mental health disorder, a mood disorder, when they are adults, when they become adults, and 3.7 times more likely to have suicidal ideation. And this is when they are adults. And oftentimes we see children behave in 2 different ways. Okay, so either if you, and it depends on the temperament of the child, on the age of the child. And I'm going to talk about the younger children and older children. So you see younger children, babies, for example. We get cases like father is strangling mother, baby is on the bed, she strangles the mother, and then she falls on the bed and the baby is under her, and the child suffocates. And there is trauma. And this trauma affects the child for life. you know
Right.
and so children actually react in different ways. So you have 2 kinds of behaviors. You have internalized behaviors. So you have the whiny, clingy baby who won't leave the mother who is abused, because they are constantly in a state of hypervigilance. They know that something is going to happen, but they can't express themselves. You have the older children in internalized behaviors. You see withdrawal. You see fear. I remember a child telling me that every time she was in school, she would wonder what's happening at home, and they can't concentrate. So, and then among older children, you see self-harm behaviors, because you can't control what's going on in the home. The
Right.
only thing that you can control is your body. So you start with self-harm behaviors, and also depression and anxiety in children. Then you have the other extreme, the externalized behaviors. Fighting in school, temper tantrums, meltdowns, aggression, and so on. And in some studies that I've done, I also saw young children, like 11, 12, 13, 14, going into substance abuse. Taking drugs or alcohol and so on. So you see these kinds of behaviors, and all this is disguised as behavioral issues. So it's treated as a behavioral issue rather than the impact of violence on children. So I think the new literature on violence actually tells us that trauma that a child goes through is actually toxic stress, and it does affect the development of the brain of the child. And in a lot of studies also have told us that a child who is consistently in an abusive environment and is consistently in a state of hypervigilance, it affects their language abilities. And in school, if you don't have language, you cannot do mathematics. Mathematics requires language. And so they academically they are also
Yeah.
affected.
Yeah.
Right.
But the good news is that if but we actually, early intervention makes a big deal. So if we can intervene early. So right now in all the specialist centers, we offer trauma focused therapy for children. And if we intervene early intervention, and it doesn't even have to be formal intervention. It could be a caring adult. It could be an uncle, an aunt, a teacher. you know uh, school as a anchor for the kids, so the brighter ones actually concentrate on their studies. The not so bright ones, the study that we did actually showed that CCAs actually are really, really good at keeping children focused, because if they don't have that kind of focus, what often happens is that they end up in juvenile delinquent behaviors. So you would see gangs coming in because the home is so chaotic. The gangs provide structure, and so they are enveloped with that love that they don't receive in school. So I think, I would like to say that, people who abuse need to recognize the impact of their behaviors on their children. Survivors need to understand that, by not seeking help, the family is impacted and there are long-term consequences. So my message to everybody is come forward and seek help. If you're a neighbor, a friend, a relative, please link them to the enormous resources that Singapore has. I mean, I think Singapore is one of the few countries that has resources for family violence, which are cheap and easily available in the social service front, and they should come forward and seek help.
Right.
Yes,
Yeah.
and Dharma, for you, there has been a lot of questions coming in about the abuse that is unseen. I know we've already discussed it somewhat in
Yeah.
our earlier today, but psychological abuse, non-obvious abuse such as a slap, what would your views be? Would your advice be still to encourage the survivor to make a police report and try to file for a PPO, notwithstanding that there is no clear or direct evidence, so to speak, of that would support their case? I think this is troubling quite a number of our
Sure.
members in the audience.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, like what Dr. Naya says, sometimes we have to remove ourselves from the act itself and look at the wider picture of what's happening in the house, or sometimes people, when they lose their jobs, they behave in a certain way. They are frustrated at work because they are subordinate at work. So when they come home, they tend to be the boss at home. So they tend to show that kind of behavior. So there may be other root causes. The and it's natural for people when they get a slap, or they are verbally abused, or this is suddenly he's so loving and then he comes home and he shouts at me. It is natural for them to want to react and say, I need to put a stop to this because I don't want him to do it again. So it's more it's more like what Dr. Naya says. There are other avenues to find help, and this literature is also available, and these concepts are also available to many family practitioners. And many family practitioners, we don't jump in immediately. Even if they come see lawyers, we do try and explore other ways in which that they can handle these problems. Of course, there's an evidentiary burden. We do also tell the client sometimes that you don't have enough to make out a case, but I hear you. You are also suffering from something, and we don't want this to happen again. So why don't you give? Like I would very gladly call Dr. Naya, and I have called her sometimes to refer my clients. Because they're not really uh, PPO ready, and I use this word because, like I said, the court has a high bar before they give something like this, because they're basically saying you don't come near this person and cause any kind of violence. And if the person who is the perpetrator, who is confused that his behavior has caused this violence, but because he's just frustrated with his work or something, tends to then shut down and say, okay lah, then I don't shout at you lah, I don't talk to you, and then they move away. So it's important for them to seek the help. The more clear ones, yeah, there are counselors out there to talk, um, and even the counselors, I encourage you to help them talk to the family members, and see what kind of support network they can get, because we are in, like I said, this girl who came to see me, she's from a good girls' school in Singapore, and I think in her school there's a lot of good messaging about women empowerment, liberation, and all that. So she brought her mom to me, and she's about 15 or 16 years old, and she says, listen, I know I will tell you everything, I will do everything, I'll help you, help my mom get a PPO, because I don't want her to, because she's just not a modern mom. She needs to help herself, and I don't like to see her like this. So it's that child coming forward, and the messaging in her school is like, women should not stand for these kind of things. So it's interesting, that that our society is getting less tolerant of this kind of behavior. So um, and I think it goes back to that question, like, do you want to help the problem, or do you just want to put a stop to the behavior, or you know what I mean? There are lots of things you got to think about. So when someone slaps you, of course, I think this question comes from a recent movie, that I think a Bollywood movie that came out about a slap, you see, and how this lady said, you know, she's not going to accept this behavior because, I don't know, maybe Dr. Nayak can say this myth or theory that if a guy hits you once, he will definitely hit you again. You know, some people really believe that, so they think, okay, once you've hit me, I'm out the door. I'm just not going to accept this kind of behavior. So I guess it's ultimately your tolerance, you see, and what you want out of this. But yeah, a PPO would help, and if there is enough, which is why the courts also know that, you know, hey, how can I just take one incident and then grant a PPO? I have to keep the bar high. So which is why they've recruited all this counseling and help and all that. So if they're prepared to go down this path, and they don't take this as a punitive measure, I'm going to take out a PPO, I'm going to slap it on your face, and I'm going to wave it every time you come near me, you know, if they don't take it like that, and they understand that it's going to take a very holistic approach, you know, the courts are going to take this approach to help you, help that person as well, help your family, you know, and you're ready to take those steps. Yeah, this is the forum, because this is the way the courts want to go for family family law. Family practitioners also respect that. Social workers also respect. There's an increasing confluence of us working together, and I think it's very helpful for families. So yeah, instead of just seeing it as an isolated criminal activity, you know, yeah.
Thank
Christine,
you.
can I add on to that? 2
Yes,
points.
very quickly. Yes.
Very quickly. The first point is that it's not just a slap. They need to look at the history. So the beginning about the systematic pattern of abuse, that's one. The last thing I'd like to say is that, you know, violence is about disrespect. You know, so if it's disrespectful behavior, so we need to turn it around and teach people respectful behaviors if they want to maintain relationships that are strong.
I think actually, Dr. Sudha, that your answer, or what you just shared, answers quite a number of questions that came in, because we have members of the audience who are concerned with normalizing the mindset to ask for help. And for our audience, I hope that from Dr. Sudha and Dharma's sharing today, it is clear to you that, and there is the reassurance for you that if you or anyone in your family requires help, whether they are the survivors, whether they are the perpetrators, there is infrastructure and support services that are ready to be tapped upon, and there are people ready to help the family get out of this struggle.
Right. Yeah. I think social workers like Dr. Nair, they know when it's time to get the lawyers involved, and I think lawyers also know when is it maybe you need to go and see a counselor first before you go to court. And I think this understanding between both professions is very liberating and good. And so, you know, to seek help in whichever direction you want to go, and I think that's where we're evolving towards, to try to help people holistically. Thanks.
Thank you. And so this just leaves me to thank everyone for your attendance today, but also our grateful thanks for Dr. Sudha and Dharma for spending the entire evening with us. Regretfully, we have to bring our session to a close. If you require any more information, there is the resources available. Those are printed on the slide. So on behalf of Law Society, Pro Bono Services, and PAVE, and our presenters, thank you everyone for joining us today, and we wish you a great evening.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.